Hi, I'm Kat. So let's start with today's word, which is legenda. 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 Well done, guys. You just said legend. The legend of the Green Children of Woolpit is about two children. Oh yeah, just a quick disclaimer before we get started. I'm going to mess up so many names today with the pronunciation and everything, so just, bear with me. The legend of the Green Children of Woolpit is about two children of unusual skin color who appeared in the village of Woolpit in Suffolk, England at some point in the 12th century, possibly during the reign of King Stephen in the years 1135-1154. The children, apparently brother and sister, were of a normal appearance except for one little detail: the green color of their skin. They spoke gibberish and they would only eat raw broad beans. There have been two main explanations of the story of the Green Children: that it's a folk tale describing an imaginary encounter with the inhabitants of another world, maybe underground or extraterrestrial, or the story presents a real event but in a distorted manner. The story was praised as an ideal fantasy by the English anarchist, poet and critic Herbert Reed in his English prose style, first published in 1928, and provided the inspiration for his only novel, The Green Child, published in 1935. According to accounts provided by two contemporary historians, William of Newburgh in his Historia Rerum Anglicarum and Ralph of Coggeshall in his Chronicum Anglicanum, the two children were discovered by locals of Woolpit who were struck by the greenish color of the two children's skin. The village of Woolpit is in the county of Suffolk, East Anglia, about 7 miles east of the town of Bury St Edmunds. During the Middle Ages, it belonged to the Abbey of Bury St Edmunds and was part of one of the most densely populated areas in rural England. Some would say that this is simply a legend, a piece of Anglo-Saxon folklore carried through to the 12th century, but there is substantial evidence to suggest that this really happened. The two historians who wrote about this, William and Ralph, were contemporaries of these events who lived in the 12th century. They were writing when these events were fresh in their memory rather than just retelling a folk story they'd heard. Ralph was the abbot of the Cistercian Coggeshall Abbey at Coggeshall, around 26 miles south of Woolpit. He was reporting on occurrences in his area and he would have known individuals who had direct first-hand experience of the children and their appearance in Suffolk. William was a canon at the Augustinian Newburgh Priory, far to the north in Yorkshire. So the story goes that at harvest time, one day during the reign of King Stephen, between the years 1135-1154, according to William, the villagers of Woolpit discovered two children, a brother and a sister, beside one of the wolf pits that gave the village its name. Their skin was green, they had no names, they spoke an unknown language, and their clothing was unfamiliar. Ralph reported that the children were taken to the home of Sir Richard the Khan. The children refused all food for several days until they came across some raw broad beans which they consumed eagerly. The children gradually adapted to normal food and in time lost their green color. It was decided to baptize the children, but the boy, who appeared to be the younger one, was sickly and he died before or soon after baptism. After learning to speak English, the children, or perhaps just the surviving girl, explained that they came from a land where the sun never shines and the light was like twilight and the people were green. William said that the girl called their home St. Martin's Land. Ralph added that everything in that land was green. According to William, the children were unable to explain how they arrived to Woolpit. They were herding their father's cattle when they heard a loud noise. According to William, it was like the sound of the bells of Bury St. Edmunds Abbey, and suddenly the children found themselves by the wolf pit where they were found. Ralph said that they got lost when they followed the cattle into a cave and, after being guided by the sounds of bells, they eventually emerged into the land. According to Ralph, the girl was employed for many years as a servant in Richard's household, where she was considered to be very disrespectful and cruel. According to William, she eventually married a man from King's Lynn, about 40 miles from Woolpit, where she was still living shortly before he wrote. Based on his research into Richard's family history, the astronomer and writer Duncan Lannon concluded that the girl was given the name Agnes and she married a royal official named Richard Barr. So how did the children get there to Woolpit, and why were they speaking an unknown language, and why was their skin green? In 1998, Paul Harris identified them as the children of Flemish immigrants who arrived in eastern England during the early 12th century and were later persecuted after Henry II became king in 1154. The children's homeland of St. Martin's Land was the village of Farnham St. Martin, just north of Bury St. Edmunds, and their parents were Flemish cloth workers settled there. In 1173, Farnham was the site of the Battle of Farnham during the Civil War between King Henry II and his son, the young King Henry. Rebel forces led by Robert de Beaumont, 3rd Earl of Leicester, together with a large number of Flemish mercenaries, landed in Suffolk but were defeated by royal forces on the banks of the River Lark. The Flemish mercenaries were slaughtered and there might have been violence against peaceful Flemish settlers in the area. The children may have fled and ultimately wandered to Woolpit. Disoriented, bewildered, speaking no English, and dressed in unfamiliar Flemish clothing, the children would have presented strangely to the Woolpit villagers. Paul Harris believed that the children's color could be explained by green sickness, the result of a dietary deficiency. Brian Houghton, talking about Paul's theory, said that displaced Flemish orphans doesn't really stand up in many respects. He suggests that it's unlikely an educated man like Richard de Calne would not have recognized the language spoken by the children as being Flemish. As for the green sickness, much of the contemporary population should probably have suffered from the same disease and also appeared green. One theory is that the children suffered from arsenic poisoning. They were left at Woolpit in a forest by their carers simply to die. Arsenic poisoning will change your skin tone, and high toxicity causes delirium, which would explain the gibberish the children were speaking. Another medical theory suggests that the boy and the girl were suffering from chlorosis, which is a type of iron deficiency brought on by malnutrition, which was common in medieval times. This can lead sufferers to develop a greenish complexion, and it's a possibility that this was the case. But this doesn't explain why they said they came from the underworld. However, another theory gives a believable explanation to everything. The green children of Woolpit were related to immigrants who arrived in England in the 12th century from the part of the Low Countries then known as Flanders, which is now the northern part of Belgium. Flemish immigrants were persecuted in England as they arrived here in considerable numbers in the first half of the 12th century. As a result, the children's parents were probably killed, leaving them alone in a strange land speaking a foreign language. Their description of coming from an underworld was a statement they made, trying to explain that they came from the south. The green color of their skin was most likely from malnourishment. This would explain why their skin color is improved in the following weeks, after the Suffolk community they were living in began feeding them properly rather than eating only broad beans, as the children claimed to have been eating before their discovery. The most likely explanation is that the green children of Woolpit were two malnourished children from Flanders who spoke Flemish rather than an alien language. Two approaches have dominated explanations of the mystery of the green children. The first is that the narrative descends from folklore describing an imaginary encounter with the inhabitants of a fairy otherworld. In some early and modern readings, this other world is extraterrestrial and the green children are alien beings. The second explanation is that it's a garbled account of a real event, although it's impossible to be certain whether the story as recorded is an authentic report given by the children or an adult invention. 20th century scholars of folklore such as Charles Oman noted that one element of the children's account, the entry into a different reality through a cave, seems to have been quite popular. Gerald of Wales, the medieval historian, tells a similar story of a boy, a truant from school, who encountered two pygmies who led him through an underground passage into a beautiful land with fields and rivers, but not lit by the full light of the sun. But the specific motive that refers to the green children is poorly attested. E. W. Bowman lists it as the only example of his English and North American folktale motives. Inhabitants of lower world visit mortals and continue to live with them. Some others say that the tale of the green children was part of a popular figment of imagination, originating in the territories of England and Wales, that of passing through a cave to another world. Martin Walsh identifies the story of the green children as a garbled account of an atavistic harvest ritual. He considers the references to Saint Martin to be significant and sees the story as evidence that the Feast of Martinmas has its origins in an English Aboriginal past, of which the children's story forms the lowest stratum. John Clark argues that there is no evidence of Saint Martin as a figure with otherworld connections, or to connect the children with an atavistic harvest ritual. Mikhail Madej of Jagiellonian University connects the hypothetical Saint Martin's land with the saint himself, echoing Anne Witt, who previously argued for a connection between Saint Martin and the underworld. Medieval folklore associated him with symbols of death, such as his being mounted on a horse, a common spirit of the period, and his carrying a stick, symbolizing resurrection. He also suggests that the two children may represent simultaneously life and death, similarly to the tales of the Green Knight. The children's pigmentation change would symbolize the passing from death to life, the revival occurring over ground. The eating of beans has also attracted the attention of folklorists. The habitual food of the children was beans, the food of the dead. Beans are in many cultures associated with the dead. Broad beans have been the symbol of death and corruption since the ancient times. However, they were also associated with rebirth and fertility. A modern version of the tale links the green children with the babes in the wood. Although there are different stories, a common motive is that they are left or taken to die in the woods, often identified as Wayland Wood or Thetford Forest, after being poisoned with arsenic by their uncle. The arsenical poisoning resulted in their color. They became further linked with the Woolpit children after escaping the woods but falling into the pits before their ultimate discovery. This version of the story was known to local author and folk singer Bob Roberts, who says in his 1978 book A Slice of Suffolk, quote, "I was told there are still people in Woolpit who are descended from the green children, but nobody would tell me who they were," end of quote. Other commentators suggested that the children may have been aliens or inhabitants of a world beneath the earth. In a 1996 article published in the magazine Analog, astronomer Duncan Lannon hypothesized that the children were accidentally transported to Woolpit from their home planet as the result of a matter-transmitter malfunction. Duncan said that the planet from which the children were expelled may be trapped in synchronous orbit around its sun, presenting the conditions for life only in a narrow twilight zone between a fiercely hot surface and a frozen dark side. He explained the children's green coloration as a side effect of consuming the genetically modified alien plants eaten by the planet's inhabitants. Duncan was actually not the first to suggest that the green children may have been extraterrestrials. Robert Barton suggested in his 1621 The Anatomy of Melancholy that the green children fell from heaven, an idea that seems to have been picked up by Francis Godwin, historian and Bishop of Hereford, in his speculative fiction The Man in the Moon, published after his death in 1638, which draws on William of Newburgh's account. Historian Derek Bewer's explanation is that these very small children, herding or following flocks straight from their forest village, spoke little and didn't know their own home address. They were probably suffering from chlorosis, a deficiency disease which gives the skin a greenish tint, hence the term green sickness. With a better diet, it disappears. Jeffrey Jerome Cohen said that the story is about racial difference. The Green Children are a memory of England's past and the conquest of the indigenous Britons by the Anglo-Saxons, followed by the Norman invasion. The Green Children represent a dual intrusion into William's unified vision of England. On one hand, they are a reminder of the ethnic and cultural differences between Normans and Anglo-Saxons, given the children's claims to have come from St. Martin's Land, named after Martin of Tours. The only other time William mentions that saint is in reference to St. Martin's Abbey in Hastings, which commemorates the Norman victory in 1066. But the children also embody the earlier inhabitants of the British Isles, the Welsh and Irish and Scots, who had been forcibly Anglicized. The Green Children resurface in another story that William was unable to tell, one in which English peninsular dominion becomes a troubled assumption rather than a foregone conclusion. The boy in particular who dies rather than become assimilated represents an adjacent world that cannot be annexed, an otherness that will perish to endure. The story of the Green Children reappeared in the early modern period with the first printed edition of William of Newburgh's Historia Rerum Anglicarum in the late 16th century. Briefly commenting on the story, in 1586, William Camden considered it a hoax. A second edition of the Historia Rerum Anglicarum in 1610 printed both William's and Ralph's texts of the story together for comparison. The tale resurfaced in the mid-Victorian period when the folklorist Thomas Keightley included it in the fairy mythology, its first publication in English. The English anarchist poet and critic Herbert Reed describes the story of the Green Children in his English prose style, first published in 1928 as the norm to which all types of fantasy should conform. It was the inspiration for his only novel, The Green Child, published in 1935. The tale has been the basis for several 20th and 21st century children's books and stories, including Judith Stinton's Tom's Tale from 1983, a trilogy by Mark Bartholomew in 2006 and 2007, and The Green Children of Woolpit by J. Anderson Coates in 2019. And guys, this was a very short one, but this is the tale of the Green Children of Woolpit. Do you believe that any of it is real? I personally think that they did exist, and if they did have indeed green color skin, it was probably due to malnutrition, and maybe when they said the sun didn't shine where they came from, they meant either caves or possibly mines they were traveling through, or it's even possible their parents were hiding them there to protect them from being massacred like the rest of the village was. But of course, considering it was the 12th century, the story will be exaggerated or interpreted in a way or another, and also they didn't have as much medical knowledge back then as we do have now, so possibly the children having some kind of a medical condition, it was something which was very strange for them. And you know, like I said, sometimes people, when they don't have an explanation, they usually come up with something to give them an explanation. Anyway, I'm really curious to know, what do you think that the Green Children of Woolpit really existed? And if you think they did, what do you think is the actual story behind? Thank you so much for watching. Take care, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!